So I am honored to introduce our fireside chat speaker for tonight, Grace Lee Boggs. As you all know, Grace is a movement activist who has participated in all of the major social movements of the 21st century. But what we really find makes her extraordinary, as cited by Americans Who Tell the Truth series, is her philosophy of constant questioning, not just of who we are as individuals, but how we relate to those in our communities and country, to those of other countries, and to the local and global environment. Grace has lived in Detroit for over 50 years. She and her husband, Jimmy Boggs, founded the Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership, which is where we sit tonight. And she continues to support activists as they rebuild, redefine, and respirit Detroit from the ground up.
All right, so we would love it if the cohort could just go around, say their name, maybe their organization, and then your personal theory of change.
My name is Nancy, and I'm with BPSOS Delaware Valley, and my personal theory of change is societal change begins with the cultivation of one's personal outrage into collective action that is guided by love. And I'm so excited to talk with you tonight.
Hello, Grace. My name is Patty Tototsintle. I'm with Casa de Esperanza in Minnesota. And my theory of change is by building the connections, relationships, and networks in communities, we support the community opportunities to create positive change.
Good evening, Grace. My name is Suzanne Keplinger. I am with the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center in Minneapolis, and my theory of change is we all deserve to be treated with respect.
Good evening, Grace. My name is Tamar Kraft Stolar. I'm with the Women in Prison Project at the Correctional Association of New York, and my personal theory of change is reach out, educate, organize, inspire, build each other, build strategy, build consciousness, organize, activate, motivate, advocate.
Hello, my name is Leanna Kinnicut with Futures Without Violence, formerly Family Violence Prevention Fund. And I believe we can end violence by building the capacity of organizations, transforming social norms, and building sustainable community leadership.
Good evening, Ms. Grace. My name is Ted Bunch. I'm with the Call to Men. The theory for change I'd like to share is that we believe that the liberation of men is directly connected to the liberation of women.
Uviat Gindi. Hello, Grace. My name is Corrine Sanchez, and I'm from Teo Women United. And my theory of change is world harmony begins from within, self, family, community.
Hi, Grace. My name is Priscilla Gonzalez, and I'm with Domestic Workers United. And my theory of change is organize at the margins and build out.
Hi, Ms. Boggs. My name is Joanne Smith, and I'm with Girls for Gender Equity. And my theory of change is we are the necessary and privileged tools in this gender justice work.
It's an honor to meet you. I'm Dorchen Leitholt, and I'm with Sanctuary for Families. And my theory of change is our best teachers are the survivors we serve. Our advocacy emerges from this service.
Hi, my name is Amy Thompson, and I'm with an organization called Close to Home in Boston. And my theory of change is use your voice, build relationships, create space for storytelling, share beautiful food, and always dance.
Hi, I'm Rachel Lloyd from GEMS. My theory of change is for us, by us.
Thank you so much. It's an honor for us to hear from you tonight. My name is Becky Masaki. I'm with the Asian and Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence. And my theory of change is peace and liberation are both the process and the prize. We are the ones we've been waiting for.
Good evening, Grace. My name is Nan Stoops. I'm the director of the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Seattle. My theory of change is to support communities worldwide to nurture strength and hope in girls and boys.
Hello, good evening. My name is Shakira Washington, and I am from the Rebecca Project for Human Rights, located in Washington, D.C. My theory of change is give the lessons of the past to the next generation so they can start one step ahead of their past.
Good evening. My name is Neil Irvin. I'm from Men Can Stop Rape in Washington, D.C., and my theory of change is continue mobilizing men and boys to be strong without being violent.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, hello everybody. I'm sorry I have no theory of change. In 1998, I wrote an autobiography called Living for Change. And I think that my whole life, without my knowing it, has been living for change, and I've been changing all the time. I've changed so much in the last 90 years. You can't believe it. I particularly began changing when my husband died, which is now 1993, it's now nearly 20 years ago. And I was on my own, and I had to figure out what I was going to do. And I think that it was then that I became conscious of the number of things that had happened to me in my life, which had kept me living for change. I think the first thing that started me living for change was when I was born female to a mother who had never learned how to read and write because she was born in a little Chinese village where there were no schools for female children, and who was my father's second wife, who gave birth to my older sister in steerage on a boat from China at the same time that his first wife was giving birth to my half-brother in China. And when I began to cry, the waiters in my father's restaurant where I was born said, "Let her die, let her go, let's throw her on the hillside, she's only a girl baby." And I began to recognize the amount of degradation of women that existed in our society. But it wasn't until the 60s, when the women's movement began, that I began to realize, appreciate how much women had to offer in a different way of looking at knowledge, at society, at working, at caring. And I think that what is most important in my development, if I have a theory of change, is to understand how much our society has objectified everybody, and how we have to return to a different and begin to develop a whole different set of values about how we treat each other and how we relate to one another. And I don't think you can do that unless you are rooted in some sense. I'm talking to you from a house where I have lived for nearly 50 years. In the same house, on the same corner, a house that was built in 1929. And so I think that sense of being rooted and caring for one place, which is so hard to acquire in our very rootless society, is the first thing that we need to think about. The opportunity to stay in one place and feel responsible for that place. I think that we not to have that sense of responsibility for a place, which is characteristic of our society, is one of the main reasons for the violence in our society. That we do not care for one another. Recently, we had on International Women's Day, we met with a number of women who were active in their plants, sponsored by the UAW. These are women activists, and what we did was we had women from the community who are creating caring communities who speak to them, speak very really, who are doing work already in their community, caring for one another, and developing a whole new way of thinking about each other. Our knowledge of each other is based so much on objectification. It's based so much on the whole attitude toward land and toward women that was created during the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, when women's knowledge was no longer respected and when the land was also taken away from the peasantry. It's very, very deeply rooted in our society, and it's only by beginning to build a different kind of relationship, a different way of knowing, a different way of caring, which we have been doing in Detroit, that I think we can begin to end violence. I think to have a theory of change, as each one of you has expressed, as if it were a sort of strategy, is kind of limited. I think we have to have a much deeper concept of how objectification and is rooted in the society we live in, and how we have to create completely different relationships with one another. And that people are ready to do that, I feel, at this time, more than at any time in the past. Because for so long we have believed that our industrial society was the best society in the world, and other people have aimed at developing that in the so-called developing world, to become like the United States, to have, to have cars and TV and to have all comforts and conveniences. And I think finally, in Detroit particularly, where we had the deindustrialization and we had the collapse of the auto industry, and in the rest of the world, which is looking at the United States now as a failed empire, or as a dying empire, that we have the opportunity to begin creating different kinds of relationships and begin creating what Martin Luther King called beloved community. We are beginning to do that in Detroit, and I hope that as you relate to one another in your community, I don't know how long for this initiative that you're engaged in, that you will think about that not so much as strategists, but as people beginning to live together in a different way, and knowing each other in a different way, and knowing reality in a different way. One of the most important things I think you do, for example, would, if you're in a camp, is begin to relate to the earth in a very different way. As a way of changing yourself. I think we have to change ourselves in order to end violence. It's not only that we have to change other people, but we have to begin transforming ourselves. And that's what I see happening here in Detroit.
Grace, thank you so much for your remarks. I'm just actually still processing everything that you've said. What is the most personally transformative experience you have had as a movement activist?
In 1967, here in the city of Detroit, we had, in reaction to the raid on after-hours joint by the police, a huge eruption of violence. Thousands of people poured out into the street, looting and burning. Whole neighborhoods were torched to the ground. And that gave people a sense that people were sort of proud of themselves. The authorities called it a riot because it was a breakdown of law and order, and it took the federal troops and the National Guard to restore law and order. But they felt very proud because they thought they had been militant in protest against police brutality and police harassment. And also they felt they were putting up a struggle against the elimination of jobs and the expendability of young people that was taking place because of automation in the plants. And they were very proud of themselves. So a lot of violence continued in the community, and we became the murder capital of the world. People thought there were 600 to 700 homicides every year. It was a situation in which neighbors were afraid of one another. You would be afraid to walk out on the streets. We had neighborhood watches where young girls going back and forth from school were accosted. And we had to create safe houses where people were looking out for them. It was a most incredible situation. And when I think of the amount of sex trafficking that's going on today, it seems to me it was on that level of violence that we were living in the city. And we began to realize that it was only if we gave young people things to do which gave them a sense of their own creativity, their own capacity to change, their own capacity to create the world anew, which every human being has, that the things would begin to change. So we created a project called Detroit Summer, which involved young people in rebuilding, redefining, and respiriting our city from the ground up. And these young people began working with elders to plant community gardens. And we began to create that bond between the generations, which is so necessary at this time. I don't know whether folks realize how much violence is based on the fact that we have the most terrible age segregation in the last few decades that has really broken up our communities, and that which has enabled human beings to evolve and survive down through the years, that's generational, intergenerational relationship and connection was lost. And the connection with the earth was also lost because we began to think in terms of progress as driving cars and having a lot of conveniences, a TV in every room. And it's only when the young people began learning from the elders how to connect with the earth and plant gardens and grow their own food that they began to change. And that began to also decrease violence. And after a while, what happened was that an urban agricultural movement began. We now have thousands of community gardens moving this way. And these young people also began working with the community to create murals and find out what the community wanted in the way of murals. And through that kind of art and that kind of creativity, they also began to change. And they began to see themselves as solutions rather than problems. Because we all look so much at every problem as a problem of the people, and we don't see the capacity within them to create the world anew. And I think that's to tap into that capacity, to tap into that which makes us human, is what begins to end violence. And it's not strategy, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking about what makes a human being and how human beings have evolved over thousands and millions of years.
So I think with that, we'd like to open up the room to the cohort to ask questions to Grace.
I was so interested to hear about how you talk about objectification and how you explain that objectification is at the core of the oppression of women and of people of color. Could you please talk a little bit more about that? Could you please explain how this process of objectification takes place and what we can do to combat it?
I would recommend an essay, a wonderful essay called Burning Times by Starhawk. You can find it on the Boggs Center website, www.boggscenter.org. What she talks about is how in the 16th and the 17th century, the witch hunts took place in Europe, which expropriated the land from the peasants and at the same time expropriated the knowledge of women, the more intuitive knowledge of women. And I think we have very little understanding of how terrible that violence was, and how it took violence actually to destroy the knowledge and the power of women. I think we need that sort of historical understanding to understand how deeply entrenched this violence is, because otherwise we're likely to deal with it in terms of particular phenomena, the number of people who are killed, the number of women who are trafficked, and so forth. It's not that. It's very deeply rooted in a ratification and erasure of women's ways of knowing and women's ways of caring. It's a very deeply historical phenomenon, and therefore it's something that has to be dealt with in a sense of rebuilding, redefining, and respiriting that involves people. Cannot be done by organizations from the top down. It has to be done by engaging people and creating different relationships among themselves.
Okay. Hi, Grace. My name is Tamar again. And my question for you is, what was and what is it like to have been part of so many different movements? how did you navigate between them? And how did you weave together your understanding of those different movements in your own experience and in speaking with other people?
Well, I didn't do it consciously, it just happened. What happened was that I got a PhD in philosophy in 1940. And at that time, even department stores would come out saying, we don't hire Orientals. So I went to Chicago and I got a job, a part-time job in the library for $10 a week, which wasn't very much money, but a lot of people didn't make much more than $500 or $1,000 a year at that time. But what I did is I got a place to live in a basement rent-free. And the only difficulty was that I had to face down a barricade of rats to get into the basement. And that made me very rat conscious. And so I joined an organization that was against rat-infested housing, which turned out to be a black organization. And that put me in touch with the black community. I hadn't tried to do that consciously. And at that time, the black community was being mobilized for a march to demand jobs for blacks in defense plants. And they were April Randall was organizing the March on Washington, and tens of thousands of people were coming out. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was scared to death that this March on Washington would expose the racism in the United States at a time when he was trying to organize for the war against racism in Europe. And that, all that just brought me in touch with the black community, and that I thought that the black community had the promise because it was able, simply by deciding to march, to force the president to issue an executive order banning discrimination in defense hiring. And I said, if a movement can do that, I'm going to become a movement activist. So I was just learning as I was going along. I think that's how one has to do. You have to learn from experience. You have to be ready to take risks to change things. You don't do it by forming organizations to begin with. I think you have to be very careful not to do that, because organizations usually tend to get funded, and they have to begin presenting a plan, and it's very hard for them to learn through experience. I think you have to learn a lot through experience just by what happens to you, and what you do works or doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, to be challenged to go on to try something else. I think that's the way that change takes place. We have an idea that change takes place by having a very clear mission statement. Now, I'm not against mission statement, but I don't think a mission statement is going to help us change the world. I think what we have to do is be rooted someplace and to be ready to take risks and to understand that every time something happens that is negative rather than positive, that's a challenge for you to try something else.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear what you consider your biggest success or achievement.
Well, I think that the biggest that I've survived, I think, this so long, and that I still have most of my marbles. I think that is because I've been involved in trying to do so many things and learning so much every time. I mean, that's what makes why I'm here. But I'm still here.
Yes. All right, so my question, because you've been around the block a few times, how have you sustained yourself throughout the decades in doing this work?
Well, very early on, when I became a feminist, I decided I was not going to be dependent on any man. And so I learned to type, and I was able to get Kelly jobs. I don't know whether you know that, but basically I worked at Kelly jobs, typing, doing shorthand, hand and office work, until I was old enough to get Social Security. That's why I live on now.
And in terms of sustaining, so a part of our work is very much about self-care and how to sustain ourselves personally. Like, and you, obviously, you were saying, like, in terms of how you are continually learning, and I think that's a big part of it. But can you give any other advice or how you kind of sustained yourself personally throughout all these movements in your work?
One of the great difficulties that happened over the last few decades is that people became very excited about organizing, being part of a movement. And they began to think that there should be a job. I think when getting a job with a nonprofit organization in order to do movement building is probably the least progressive way to become a movement activist. I think it's better to try and support yourself by doing certain things, by being creative and going to an office or selling something, doing crafts, finding inventive ways to support yourself rather than being supported in a paying job.
Thank you, Grace. Actually, so funny that you just said that. I actually have two questions. So my first question is, where do you see are the primary sites of intervention in the struggle to end violence against women and girls? So that's my first question. And my second is, considering what you just said about working in institutions like nonprofits, do you feel like nonprofits or these type of institutions have a role in movement, like either support or strategy or anything like that? Or sustainability? Like, what roles do institutions have in movement building?
Well, I don't deny that there are there are occasions when one has to be thinking about funding. But I think that the degree of reliance on funding and on nonprofit organizations and on foundations in the last period has not been helpful in terms of encouraging creativity. I'm sorry, when I heard all your theories of change, I thought, God, they come from presenting an application for a grant.
I think the idea, the problems within the system of nonprofits for funding is definitely one that a lot of people who work in nonprofits struggle with. And I think what Nancy is trying to get at is because some of us are rootless, we try to do the work that we do in spaces that have already kind of begun that work. And so can you, I think we we understand kind of that, it is very restrictive at times. But do you think like there is some power in that, or like how can we harness or change that model so that all these people with very good intentions can become more powerful and not, not be thinking about grant writing, but thinking about how to do the change that they're, wholeheartedly trying to accomplish?
Well, I don't know whether you know the organization Women Against Violence, but they put out a series of pamphlets, and one of them was called "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded." I think to grasp that concept and understand that the revolution will not be funded, that it depends on the creativity of people, beginning with yourself, and the challenge that is involved in devising ways whereby you can do things. Because what happens, I've seen happen, is that when you begin being funded, you begin creating a gulf between the people in the community who are volunteers and the people who are working, have a job. And the people who have a job doing the work of bringing about community change begin finding themselves more comfortable sitting down at lunch with the funders than with the people in the community.
Earlier, you talked about the importance of being rooted in community as a place to start making change. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of place-based or neighborhood-based work in the context of movements.
Well, I think that, I'm glad you used the phrase community-based, place-based. I think that we are at the point where our communities are disintegrating because, we are in what helped the community to survive in the past was that people had jobs in industry, and those jobs are gone. And unless people begin thinking differently about how we live with one another, how we begin creating beloved. I don't know whether you know a program called Time Banking. It's a wonderful program that we're beginning to utilize to grow here in Detroit, where people begin living, taking care of one another, exchanging skills. And I think we have to go back to that sort of society to know that until a few hundreds of years ago, that's how people lived, through community. I don't know whether you know a book called The Great Transformation by Carl Polanyi, but I certainly urge that you read it. Because he tells the story of how community led things to people worked in terms of the community and the needs of the community. And they thought differently, and they didn't think the way you think when you go to a job and get paid for the job. You don't think about how much you're getting paid by the hour and how many hours you work. And the caring about what you do begins to diminish, decline. We have to go beyond job thinking. We have to go beyond job thinking. We're at the point, I think, where we're reimagining work. In fact, we're organizing a conference here in Detroit in the fall, which is around the reimagining of work. And we'll be showcasing all the things that people are doing as they have begun to understand that jobs are not coming back. That we have to reimagine why we work and how we work in relationship to one another. relationship to our communities. This is a huge cultural revolution, transformation that's taking place, that we are a part of. And I think to have that consciousness that there is a cultural transformation that is deep and is wide-ranging as a transformation from hunting and gathering to agriculture 11,000 years ago, and from agriculture to industry a few hundred years ago. We are in the midst of that great transformation, and we are very fortunate to be in the midst of that great transformation because it's a human transformation, not only of institutions but of ourselves.
I was wondering if you could expand on what you think are some of the most powerful tools, strategies, and tactics that have been used and that you have used in the many movements that you've been involved in.
But the most useful thing I've found is to listen to people and to understand that everyone has the power within themselves to create the world anew. And that's what makes us human. And to begin to understand that and really to live that is, I think, what makes change possible. Because you change yourself as you listen to others.
Thank you.
How have you seen the evolution in how the issues that impact girls and women, how those issues have been perceived and addressed in the different movements that you've been a part of?
Look at my t-shirt.
Can you see your t-shirt?
You see? Revolution and evolution. I think the understanding of revolution as evolution, that human beings are in the continual process of evolving to become more human. I think when we understand that, when we begin to understand the world in which we're living and the tremendous opportunity we have to become more human with everything that we do.
So Grace, you had mentioned beloved communities. Can you talk a little bit more about what the beloved communities is and the movement around that?
Well, I would urge folks to look at and read the speech that Martin Luther King made in 1967, which is called the Break the Silence speech at Riverside Church, in which he talked about making a radical revolution of values against materialism, militarism, and racism. Not only against racism, but against and helped us to see the interconnection between them. I think we have failed. We talk too much, or not too much. We isolate one another. We just don't understand that racism didn't come into being just because white people didn't like black people or people of color. It came into being because at a certain time in the history of the evolution of human beings, they wanted to pursue economic growth. And there weren't enough people in this country to achieve economic growth at a rapid rate. So they brought in African Americans and enslaved them. And so they took over the land from the Native Americans. And their values began to change. We have to make a radical revolution of values against that materialism. People talk about materialism mainly as poverty. I think Martin Luther King meant materialism as consumerism. And Gandhi, by the way, I always like to say this, Gandhi was very suspicious of industrial society because he felt that it would bring us to the point where we could not distinguish between our needs and our wants. And that's where we are.
I was wondering how you would describe your beloved community. And as you're sitting there talking to us, I'm acutely aware that you're talking to us from Detroit. And I can't think of a city in this country that has been devastated as much by a collision of economic and political forces as Detroit. How do you feel about your community, and do you feel that there's hope for your geographic community at this time?
Well, I don't know whether you've seen my book called The Next American Revolution. I think
Yes, everyone got a copy actually.
Well, there's a chapter in the book that's called Detroit, Space and Place to Begin Anew. I can remember looking out at vacant lots and thinking that's blight, and being told by African American elders, no, that is a place to plant food for ourselves and to begin to help young people understand that change takes time. To overcome that backwardness that you have as a city person that believes that change takes place by pushing a button. Because how we begin looking at reality, the eyes with which you look at reality, whether you see back empty lots filled with dead cats and old rubber tires as blight, or whether you see that as a place that can be cleaned up and grow food. I have a story that I like to tell of an empty lot opposite the school, which the community agents and students cleaned up. We got rid of the mattresses and the old rubber tires and the dead cats. And there was a little girl, 7 years old, who never spoke, and they thought she was a mute. And one day she picked a radish and she said, Mrs. Hollins, I think it was, this is a radish. She said this whole sentence. And that's what life connection with the earth can do for you. And that's what we lose in the city. We think that progress is fast cars.
I'm curious about what you think or what you have seen over the past 7 decades and what you think about the youth today. We talk a lot and we work a lot with youth and young people and see them as activists and agents of change. And when I think of youth, I'm talking about under 18, not the new 35-year-old youth that we're talking about here. The under 18, 19-year-olds that are in the field doing this work. What have you seen now, good or bad?
Well, I think our society has come to see youth as a problem, whereas I think of youth as a solution. I think that I very often think about the way that our young people today experience the same sort of crisis that we do as adults. They watch the same TV, they listen to the same radio, that you get that same sense that society is breaking down. And yet we don't give them an opportunity to do anything about it. We ask them to go to school and learn all sorts of information which they can pick up any time, and then we test them on that. And we don't see that as a form of child abuse, not to give children an opportunity to be of use. I think if we change our whole attitude and understood that children, every human being, needs to be of use, and a child needs to be that from the very beginning. And we put them in schools, divorced from the community, and then expect them to learn and punish them if they don't. And then we wonder why they drop out.
Thank you, Grace. I'd like to actually ask a question about leadership. In your newest book, you talk about how we are the leaders we've been waiting for. So we'd like to know, what does leadership mean to you, and what makes a good leader?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is change our thinking from the vertical concept of leadership to a more horizontal concept of leadership. When I was in the movement in the 60s particularly, we would have male leaders mostly speaking to you from big platforms, very loud, very aggressively. And you weren't a leader unless you could be like that. And I think that that has changed enormously, and that to the better, because people understand that that kind of leadership only perpetuates itself and actually disempowers other people. I think I said what we see emerging now in the world among young people is a much more horizontal concept of leadership. And I think particularly, and I use the example in the book of a young woman I knew her when she was older. Her name was Zahara Simmons, and she was in the civil rights movement. And she had joined the movement from Spelman College in Atlanta. And she was supposed to go out during Mississippi Freedom Summers, she was supposed to go out in the communities and get people to register. And she was terrified that she had to go talk to strangers. And the first door she knocked on, the people who came to the door said, "We've been waiting for you." I think to understand that there are people who are waiting for you to take a step, to propose something they can do. I don't mean that everybody's going to jump on board, but we live in a situation where people are desperate for some kind of change. They know that change is necessary, and we have to be able to suggest things that they can do and projects that they can join. That's what I see happening here in Detroit. And so many people, we have a garden not far from here that's called the Freedom Growers. This couple have taken the responsibility of just planting a garden because they understand that until we feed ourselves, we can't feed ourselves. And they've created this garden that they call Freedom. And I think it's that sort of thing that gives people an idea of what is very simple that they can do, that we have to begin thinking about, not in terms of complex strategies and plans. And being funded gives you temps to have big plans.
Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in the leadership of females, and particularly what leadership of women and girls in social movements has looked like?
Well, we have our Detroit summer. There came a group of young people who now lead the Allied Media Conference, which is held annually, and which will take place this year in Detroit from June 22nd to June 26th. And it's mostly female-led. And I think if you will come to that conference here in Detroit, you will see female leadership in action. In fact, I made the closing remarks at the YBA conference 2 or 3 years ago, and I talked about the different style of leadership in this period. The remarks may be someplace, I don't know, on the web. But I think it's changing your paradigm. I heard someone earlier use that phrase, paradigm shift. I think to understand the concept of paradigm shift is so very important. I think the best example, of course, of paradigm shift in history is the Copernican revolution, when human beings discovered that instead of the sun going around the earth went around the sun. It began changing a whole lot of things. We need a paradigm shift in the concept of leadership and in the practice of leadership.
You know, in your experience in the work that you've done and the communities that you've worked in, particularly Detroit, that have experienced a great deal of violence, interpersonal violence, structural violence. So I was wondering, what have you seen that has helped heal the violence in all the time that you've been working, and what examples, like what type of work, what type of practices help individuals heal from violence and trauma and the community as well?
I think one of the things that we had in Detroit, which was very important, was the respect for elders. My husband always found an old person to whom he related. And when one died, he would find another. And so I was trying to understand why he did this. And I think it's because when you relate to an elderly person, you have a different sense of time. You have an idea of what it's like to have lived a long time, to have survived a long time. And it begins to change you. I think you have to relate both to older people and to younger people. And that it's that connection to different generations which has enabled us to evolve. You have to believe that very deeply in your heart, that our evolution to more human beings has taken place through that intergenerational connection. It's a view of the world. It's a view of evolution. How evolution takes place, how we become more human through certain practices, and how that has happened. I mean, we wouldn't be here. I mean, we wouldn't be, it's not just that we have evolved anatomically so that we have some kind of, I forget what kind of summit it is that we have, and we walk on 2 legs instead of 4. It's not just anatomical evolution that's taking place. There has been psychological, emotional evolution that has been going on over the millennia. And we are at another stage of evolution, and understanding that evolution and how it is taking place is so very important for us in our daily activities.
There's so much about the state of the world today, the state of our world, that can cause us to feel really depressed and disheartened. But we also need joy and hope and inspiration. And I'm wondering, where do you find joy and hope and inspiration?
Well, I would like to refer to the fact that when I was in my first year of graduate school, I read Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. Hegel was a young man at the beginning of the French Revolution. He danced around the Tree of Liberty, and then he went through all the hardships and the contradictions of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic dictatorship. And out of that, he wrote this book called The Phenomenology of Mind, which talks about how progress does not take place in a straight line, but through the labor, patience, and suffering of the negative. I think one has to have that philosophy that every time you face a new obstacle, a new contradiction, it's a challenge to you to take another leap and to be able to create a new positive out of that negative is what it means constantly to be changing and to help you to bring about change. It's a way of thinking.
So Grace, we have one final closing question. It's a little bit different than the other questions we've been asking you. But this is a question that we've asked each and every single person in the cohort, as well as our fellow, our fireside chat speakers last night. And the question is, currently, what is the most fun thing you do?
Drink beer.
Thank you so much, Grace.
Thank you so much, Grace.
All right. Well,
See you soon. Bye.
bye. Standing ovation.